Western Philosophy, with Durant, Chapter 6. Paragraph 3, from Rosseau to Kant, page 270 to page 279. To the argument of the Enlightenment, the reason makes for materialism, Berkeley had essayed the answer that matter does not exist. But this had led, in Hume, to the retort that, by the same token, mind does not exist either. Another answer was possible, that reason is no final test. There are some theoretical conclusions against which our whole being rebels. We have no right to presume that these demands of our nature must be stifled at the dictates of a logic which is, after all, but the recent construction of a frail and deceptive part of us. How often our instincts and feelings push aside the little syllogism which would like us to behave like geometrical figures, and makes love with mathematical precision. Sometimes, no doubt, and particularly in the noble complexity and artificialities of urban life, reason is the better guide. But in the great crisis of life and in the great problems of conduct and belief, we trust to our feelings rather than to our diagrams. If reason is against religion, so much the worse for reason. Such, in effect, was the argument of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, who almost alone in France fought the materialism and atheism of the Enlightenment. What a fate for a delicate and neurotic nature to have been cast amidst the robust rationalism and the almost brutal hedonism of the encyclopedists. Rosseau had been a sickly youth, driven into brooding and introversion by his physical weakness and the unsympathetic attitude of his parents and teachers. He had escaped from the stings of reality into a hothouse world of dreams, where the victories denied him in life and love could be had for the imagining. His confession revealed an unreconciled complex of the most refined sentimentality with an obtuse sense of decency and honor, and through it all an unsullied conviction of his moral superiority. In 1749, the Academy of Dijon offered a prize for an essay on the question, has the progress of the sciences and the arts contributed to corrupt or to purify morals? Rousseau's essay won the prize. Culture is much more of an evil than a good, he argued, with all the intensity and the sincerity of one who, finding culture out of his reach, proposed to prove it worthless. Consider the frightful disorders which printing has produced in Europe. Whenever philosophy arises, the moral health of the nation decays. It was even a saying among the philosophers themselves that since learned men had appeared, honest men were nowhere to be found. I venture to declare that a state of reflection is contrary to nature, and that a thinking man, an intellectual, as we would now say, is a depraved animal. It would be better to abandon our older, over rapid development of the intellect, and to aim rather at training the heart and the affections. Education does not make a man good, it only makes him clever, usually for mischief. Instinct and feeling are more trustworthy than reason. In his famous novel, La Nouvelle Heloise, 1761, Rosseau illustrated at great length the superiority of feeling to intellect. Sentimentality became the fashion among the ladies of the aristocracy, and among some of the men. France was for a century watered with literature, and then with actual tears and the great movement of the European intellect in the 18th century gave way to the romantic emotional literature of 1789 to 1848. The current carried with it a strong revival of religious feeling. The ex- ex- ecstasy of Chateaubriand's Genie du Christianism, 1802, were merely an echo of the confession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, which Rousseau included in his epical essay on education, Emile, 1762. The argument of the confession was briefly this: that though reason might be against the belief in God and immortality, feeling was overwhelming in their favor. Why should we not trust in instinct here rather than yield to the despair of an arid skepticism? When Kant read Emile, he omitted his daily walk under the linden trees in order to finish the book at once. It was an event in his life to find here another man who was groping his way out of the darkness of atheism, and who boldly affirmed the priority of feeling over theoretical reason in these supra-sensual concerns. Here at last was the second half of the answer to irreligion. Now, finally, all the scoffers and the doubters would be scattered. To put these threads of argument together, to unite the ideas of Berkeley and Hume with the feelings of Rousseau, to save religion from reason, and yet at the same time to save science from skepticism, this was the mission of Immanuel Kant. But who was Immanuel Kant? Section 2. Kant himself. He was born at Königsberg, Prussia, in 1724, except for a short period of tutoring in a nearby village. This quiet little professor, who loved so much to lecture on the geography and ethnology of distant lands, never left his native city. He came of a poor family which had left Scotland some 100 years before Emmanuel's birth. His mother was a pietist, example, a member of a religious sect which, like the Methodists of England, insisted on the full strictness and rigor of religious practice and belief. Our philosopher was so immersed in religion from morning to night that on the one hand he experienced a reaction which led him to stay away from church all through his adult life, and on the other hand he kept to the end of somber stamp of the German Puritan, and felt as he grew old a great longing to preserve for himself and the world the essentials at least of the faith so deeply inculcated in him by his mother. But a young man growing up in the age of Frederick and Voltaire could not insulate himself from the skeptical current of the time. Kant was profoundly influenced even by the men whom later he aimed to refute, and perhaps most of all by his favorite enemy, Hume. We shall see later the remarkable phenomenon of a philosopher transcending the conservatism of his maturity and returning in almost his last work, and at almost the age of 70, to a virile liberalism that would have brought him martyrdom had not his age and his fame protected him. Even in the midst of his work of religious restoration, we hear, with surprising frequency, the tones of another Kant, whom we might almost mistake for a Voltaire. Schopenhauer thought it not the least merit of Frederick the Great, that under his government Kant could develop himself and dared to publish his critique of pure reason. Hardly under any other government would a salaried professor, therefore in Germany a government employee, have ventured such a thing. Kant was obliged to promise the immediate successor of the great Kant that he would write no more. It was in appreciation of this freedom that Kant dedicated his The Critic to Zedlitz, Frederick's far-sighted and progressive Minister of Education. In 1755, Kant began his work as private lecturer at the University of Königsberg. For 15 years he was left in this lowly post. Twice his applications for a professorship was refused. At last, in 1770, he was made professor of logic and metaphysics. After many years of experience as a teacher, he wrote a textbook of pedagogy, of which he used to say that it contained many excellent perceptions, none of which he had ever applied. Yet he was perhaps a better teacher than writer, and 2 generations of students learned to love him. One of his practical principles was to attend most to those pupils who were of middle ability. The dances, he said, were beyond all help, and the geniuses would help themselves. Nobody expected him to startle the world with a new metaphysical system. To startle anybody seemed the very last crime that this timid and modest professor would commit. He himself had no expectations in that line. At the age of 42, he wrote, "I have the fortune to be a lover of metaphysics, but my mistress has shown me few favors as yet." He spoke in those days of the bottomless abyss of metaphysics, and of metaphysics as a dark ocean without shores or lighthouse, strewn with many a philosophic wreck. He could even attack the metaphysicians as those who dwelt on the high towers of speculation, where there is usually a great deal of wind. He did not foresee that the greatest of all metaphysical tempests was to be of his own blowing. During these quiet years, his interests were rather physical than metaphysical. He wrote on planets, earthquakes, fire, winds, ether, volcanoes, geography, ethnology, and 100 other things of that sort, not usually confounded with metaphysics. His theory of the heavens, 1755, proposed something very similar to the nebular hypothesis of Laplace and attempted a mechanical explanation of all the sidereal. Motion and development. All the planets, Kant thought, have been or will be inhabited, and those that are farthest from the sun haven't had the longest period of growth, have probably a higher species of intelligent organisms that any yet produced on our planet. His Anthropology, put together in 1798 from the lectures of a lifetime, suggested the possibility of the animal origin of man. Kant argued that if the human infant in early ages, when man was still largely at the mercy of wild animals, had cried as loudly upon entering the world as it does now, it would have been found out and devoured by beasts of prey, that in all probability, therefore, man was very different at first from what he had become under civilization. And then Kant went on subtly how nature brought about such a development and by what causes it was aided. We know not. This remark carries us a long way. It suggests the thought whether the present period of history, on the occasion of some great physical revolution, may not be followed by a third, when an orang-outan or a chimpanzee would develop the organs which serve for walking, touching, speaking, into the articulated structure of a human being, with a central organ for the use of understanding, and gradually advance under the training of social institutions. Was this use of the future tense Kant's cautiously indirect way of putting forth his view of how man had really developed from the beast? So we see the slow growth of this simple little man, hardly 5 feet tall, modest, shrinking, and yet containing in his head, or generating there, the most far-reaching revolution in modern philosophy. Kant. Life, says one biographer, passed like the most regular of regular verbs: rising, coffee drinking, writing, lecturing, dining, walking. Says Heine. Each had its set time, and when Immanuel Kant, in his grey coat, cane in hand, appeared at the door of his house, and strolled towards the small avenue of linden trees, which is still called the Philosopher's Walk. The neighbors knew it was exactly 3:30 by the clock. So he promenaded up and down during all seasons, and when the weather was gloomy or the grey clouds threatened rain, his old servant Lamp was seen plodding anxiously after, with a large umbrella under his arm, like a symbol of prudence. He was so frail in physique that he had to take severe measures to regiment himself. He thought it safer to do this without a doctor, so he lived to the age of 80. At 70, he wrote an essay on the power of the mind to master the feeling of illness by force of resolution. One of his favorite principles was to breathe only through the nose, especially when outdoors. Hence, in autumn, winter, and spring, he would permit no one to talk to him on his daily walks. Better silence than a cold. He applied philosophy even to holding up his stockings by hands passing up into his trousers pockets, where they ended in springs contained in small boxes. He thought everything out carefully before acting, and therefore remained a bachelor all his life long. Twice he thought of offering his hand to a lady, but he reflected long that in one case the lady married a bolder man, and in the other the lady removed from Königsberg before the philosopher could make up his mind. Perhaps he felt, like Nietzsche, that marriage would hamper him in the honest pursuit of truth. A married man, Talleyrand, used to say, will do anything for money, and Kant had written at 22 with all the fine enthusiasm of omnipotent youth. I have already fixed upon the line which I am resolved to keep. I will enter on course, and nothing shall prevent me from pursuing it. And so he persevered through poverty and obscurity, sketching and writing and rewriting his magnum opus for almost 15 years, finishing it only in 1781 when he was 57 years old. Never did a man mature so slowly, and then again, never did a book so startle and upset the philosophic world. This part is over.